Welcome to the Workology Podcast, a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader. Join host Jessica Miller-Merrell, founder of Workology.com, as she sits down and gets to the bottom of trends, tools, and case studies for the business leader, HR, and recruiting professional who is tired of the status quo. Now here's Jessica with this episode of Workology.
Welcome to the Workology Podcast, sponsored by ACE the HR Exam and Upskill HR. These are two courses that we offer for HR certification prep and recertification, all for HR leaders, and you can learn more at Workology.com. This particular podcast series is a new one, and it's called the HR Basics series. It is where we uncover common yet complicated topics within the world of human resources. And these are for anybody in HR. So I'm tapping into the brain trust of our HR consultants to guide us in these very complex areas of HR within different fields and different topics. The HR Basics series involves consultants, and they support multiple clients and customers through consulting, advising, and other support services for businesses of all sizes and industries, as you are going to see. In this specific episode, we're tackling the topic of onboarding and offboarding. Both onboarding and offboarding are critical for a company's success. Effective onboarding boosts new employee productivity, also boosts engagement and retention, while well-managed offboarding ensures knowledge transfer, data security, and valuable feedback for continuous improvement. Together, these processes contribute to a positive organizational culture, better performance, and a strong employer brand, which I think we all want. But the question is, how do we do this as HR leaders? According to Gallup, just 1 in 8 employees strongly agree that their new hires at organizations receive an excellent orientation and onboarding experience. 1 in 8. Additionally, the first few weeks on the job are a major tipping point for new hires, and 20% of employees quit, do so within the first 45 days of their job. I really want to talk about and dive into this topic with our expert. But before I introduce today's HR Basics podcast guest, I do want to hear from you. Please comment podcast on our pinned post over on our Instagram account at Workology Blog. You can ask me questions, leave comments, and make suggestions for future podcast guests. I want to hear from you. Feedback is a gift. So today's guest is Mindy Honcoop, tenured people leader and HR advisor, passionate about writing, speaking, and advising HR technology companies. So with over 20 years of experience in the field, Mindy has guided leaders in optimizing their workplace and also has become a respected author, speaker, and trusted advisor, as you're going to see in our industry. She is the founder of Agile in HR. Mindy brings her expertise to help organizations develop agile and human-centered workplaces. Her extensive knowledge and experience have led her to hold leadership roles at companies such as Care.com, Spiceworks, Ziff Davis, and Expedia, to name a few. Mindy, welcome to the Workology Podcast.
It's such a pleasure to be here, Jessica. Thank you.
Mindy and I have known each other for a few years. I think we met during the pandemic here in
That's
Austin.
right.
And
Yep.
You are just everyone listening or watching, this is just going to be a great conversation. Mindy is, in my mind, untapped in terms of her knowledge. She has so many resources and insights. So you're going to love this conversation.
Oh, thanks, Jessica. I've often wanted to record our conversations in the past, so I'm excited we're finally doing it.
I don't know. There's a few that I don't think we need recorded, but that's okay. That's okay. Let's talk a little bit about your background and tell us what led to your current role.
Yeah. So I was a HR practitioner and leader for over 20 years, mostly in the tech industry. Started out at Microsoft in 2000. And as I left my last chief people officer job at the end of 2021, I was looking for that next full-time leadership position. I thought that's what you do. That's the next step. And as I started to interview, especially within small, medium businesses, which I was really passionate because that is where my superpower of HR, people operations, really, I think, has the greatest impact and it has the most value. And so as I was interviewing, I realized that they were starting to become advising sessions. And that when I was going throughout the process, we're taking kind of the notes of what I was giving them in the interviews. And then they are hiring where I would keep track. I get through the end of the process. And then once I found out who did they decide on at the end, it was often someone that had less experience, most likely had a lower price point. And not necessarily did they want someone that was going to be able to come in and have strategy. It was more from a process of they were really looking for outcomes that were about kind of maintaining payroll and benefits, having someone that was sitting on the kind of tactical and compliance island of HR. And they were having a hard time kind of like seeing how is that different? How are we rethinking? How are we taking HR out of the 90s and 80s to today? And then I interviewed for someone who hired me as the HR advisor to the CEO, and they hired a chief people officer that had less experience. And that kind of was a light bulb moment for me. I was like, huh. And literally the guidance they gave me was like, hey, Mindy, we need someone of your expertise for the strategy, being able to think about, that human-centered design and the agility, but we're not at the point yet that we need someone full time. You would get bored. We need someone that is going to provide your guidance at a fraction of the time. We don't need you 40 hours a week, but we need you a couple hours a week and a couple hours per month, potentially. And so that's where I dived into the world of fractional and advising, and I became super passionate because it was true. Some of these organizations weren't at the point yet where they needed someone to be at that strategic level and being with the executive team 40, 50, 60 hours a week, but they still cared and they wanted to make a difference and they wanted to be people focused. So they knew they needed to tap into the brain of someone with that level of knowledge and in a way that they could afford.
I find this really interesting, and I'm glad that you got the feedback, because what I'm thinking as other people are listening into this podcast or watching the conversation unfold, they're nodding their head and thinking like, this is something that I think has happened to me, but it wasn't articulated like it was maybe to you. So I think that especially as many of us are in the job market right now looking for something or considering making a move, whether it is to a new role or maybe they're considering moving into a fractional people type consulting role, it's nice. It's a gift that you got that feedback,
Yeah.
because it's, I think, led you down this really amazing path and how you support businesses.
Yeah, I am lucky because there are other fractional leaders that it took a moment for them to kind of get to the place where they understood, what does fractional look like. They were often going into small, medium businesses. At first, it really felt like, okay, it was really strategic because they were setting something up. They were taking something to the next level. But then they got stuck into this like maintenance because that's just what the business needed at that time. And that kind of the area of where their superpower was or where they added value wasn't needed 40 hours a week. It was only needed several hours even in a month, and then they were getting bored and they were feeling that they weren't being listened to, and then they realized, oh, they need someone that is more like junior to be able to do the day to day, but need someone to come in and provide that mentorship, that guidance, be able to kind of understand and push back with the executive team, but that wasn't needed every day. And so they were going from one opportunity to the next before they realize, oh, I'm kind of in this in between place. I want to work with small, medium businesses, but it's not in a full time capacity.
So I did mention some scary stats at the beginning of the podcast about onboarding and offboarding.
Mhm.
And let's define these also. So talk to us about your definition of onboarding and offboarding processes.
I love this question, Jessica, because often I feel that it's always on our wish list to be doing onboarding and offboarding better, but often gets set aside. And yet it's like one of the most important things we could do to, as we for onboarding, welcome someone into the organization. That for me starts all the way in that interview process when you are giving them an offer letter. And once they sign it, all the work that you're doing from the moment they sign that offer letter to their first day, that's the pre-boarding. And then once we have them on their first day, I like to really think about what is that first day experience? And then it's about ramping into their role. And so this is often described as 30, 60, 90 days, and often is just kind of cut and pasted across the organization. But for someone to be fully functional in the different roles that our organization has probably actually looks really different. To be fully functional may take a different time period depending on the level of that role. What is the work that they're doing? And so these are the things that when we really dig in and look at that employee journey from that defined like onboarding experience, it gets really powerful. And then offboarding, the definition is I always like to think about instead of termination, I like to think of how are we departing our employees. I think this is often overlooked because what I loved about back at Microsoft is that you said you are offboarding people who could potentially be referring you, that could come back, that could be using your product. And so we need to treat people as we offboard them, as we depart them, with the utmost of respect that we did when we onboarded them. So what does that look like? And walking them through the steps, no matter what led to the decision of them leaving, and really creating that human experience.
When you mention offboarding, it's not just termination. Think about it. Because when they give their notice, like plans have to be made, training needs to be had, and hopefully they're willing to share and offboard their knowledge and expertise to another person. And also their benefits while they end, like company sponsor benefits end on their last day of employment or the end of the month, depending upon how your planned occupant is written. They have COBRA options depending upon your size of your organization. So they are still going to be with you. Their 401k is still, until it's rolled over, part of your organizational benefit program. So the referral piece, I think, is one component. It's not over. And
No.
regardless if it was a voluntary or involuntary termination, the offboarding process should still be happening, and it should happen, in my opinion, with grace.
Yes. Wait, Jessica, you just took it down to another level, which is why it is so important to really look at that employee journey and kind of all the touch points, all the moments that matter, and all the key stakeholders. Because we often forget, what about the team, about the people who are currently in place? Even as we welcome someone into a new role, like how does that impact if this is a new role that hasn't existed before? Have we really clearly defined how do the current team members, how are they going to work with this person, how are we introducing them, how do we expect them to partner, what are those success outcomes, not just for the person that we're bringing in but for the current team members, same as what you're saying when they're leaving. How are we allowing time to say goodbye? How are we communicating that departure that really sends a message to the people that remain?
The departure is important, and regardless if it's like I said, voluntary or involuntary. I will share a story. It's been a while since I've been in corporate HR, but these moments that we have, these conversations, these communications, regardless of whatever the outcome is or what led to this point, make a difference. And it has been 15 years since I've worked at Office Max. And recently, I had a former employee who I terminated as a result of an investigation. It was like a major policy violation, and we had to just suspend him and conduct the investigation before I brought him back into the office and said, "Hey, here's the outcome. Here's the next steps." This individual sent me a note a couple months ago. Like I said, 15 years, over 15 years.
Mm.
And their message to me was, you were very kind to me in a moment that I was incredibly stressed and overwhelmed, and I didn't know the outcome of what was going to happen. And I've always carried that with you. Like, thank you for that. And I haven't forgotten. And so I get a little emotional because I feel like it's been 15 years, but obviously this person, like, I impacted them in a situation that was pretty scary for them, right? It impacted them financially and in a number of different ways. But because of the way I handled it, I always try to handle things, again, with kindness and grace, whatever they did or didn't do or whatever occurred, like treating people like people and giving them an opportunity to exit the organization in a way that doesn't make them feel, I mean, unless they've broken a law or something, right? That's a different situation. But like with kindness. And this guy was like, he sent me a note, and it's been over 15 years. And that's what offboarding, I think, even in those uncomfortable situations, should be about.
Yeah. Yeah. Because you care. You took the moment to care. And
it stuck with them.
Yeah, and it stuck with him. And you know what? Humans are so complex, and we're so messy. And we as HR business partners, like, especially as we're departing, and HR leaders, we may not know the whole story. We may not know everything that's going on, and it's so easy to jump to assumption, and to be able to make sure that we're checking our emotions, and that we are taking a step back and remembering not to label. It's easy to also label someone quickly as bad. And to remember instead that they're the label of human, that is such an important reminder, Jessica. I love that story.
I think most people have been terminated voluntarily at some point in their career, myself included. Yeah. I was fired because of my blog, which was completely not nefarious. It was anonymous, like the blog that you're reading, Workology, like in the earlier version. My company was really terrified. So, and that experience for me offboarding was not a pleasant one. But I like to think about regardless of how that happened, still when somebody is exiting the organization, how would I want to exit if it was voluntary or involuntary termination? And so offboarding is an important part of that. But I think I heard a story the other day of somebody, an HR director, who gave their notice, small organization, and they were willing to offboard correctly and give time, and the owners pulled them in, had locked them out of their email, and sent them on their way. So I would just say those are unfortunately normal things, but we can help change that, which is part of why we're having this conversation today.
Yes. Yes.
Let's take a reset here. This is Jessica Miller-Merrell, and you're listening to the Workology Podcast, powered by HR Exam and Upskill HR with Mindy Honcoop, fractional people leader and founder of Agile in HR. If you're listening to this over on the regular Workology Podcast, the extended version is available exclusively for my Upskill HR members. It is worth 1 HRCI and SHRM recertification credit. If you're already over on Upskill HR, look for your certificate at the conclusion of the extended podcast. So for those of you who are like, what is going on? You can go over to Upskill HR, the extended version of my conversation with Mindy. It is worth 1 HRCI and SHRM recertification credit. It's part of our membership over there. Head on over to upskillhr.com. If you would like to leave me some feedback, I would love to hear it. Comment podcast on my pinned Instagram post over at Workology blog, where you can ask me questions, make suggestions, and leave comments for future podcast guests. Let's get back to hearing Mindy on the Workology Podcast. So I want to move on and talk about the stages of onboarding first, and who owns onboarding, because there is this, it's like, is it recruiters? Is it the new hire? Is it IT? Is it HR? Is it the CEO? Is it the hiring manager? Like, who should own this? And then what are the different stages in your mind?
So if I love, first of all, who owns onboard. I think that's often why onboarding doesn't get the attention that it needs, because it becomes a siloed ownership. And then the pieces of onboarding, like IT owns that bit, HR owns this bit, and then it becomes this very disconnected experience for employees. And that's often the feedback that we hear, that this was confusing. Where do I go to get my IT answers? And I think from an ownership perspective, if we think about it as a program, I often think it is in the HR team the oversight, but they don't own all the pieces. So in organizations that I work with, I like to think about it from a committee perspective and really thinking about co-shaping that together to be able to have the voice of our key stakeholders in there, especially the key ones like IT. And if you're in a manufacturing, or your safety and compliance person is going to be really necessary. Learning and development, if there is a lot of training that's involved. And so, but I do think that we need to have that executive sponsor. And I think since it is such a people focused, employee focused, that it should live in our people ops world. And it's the key to really helping someone be successful. People make decisions about if they made a good decision or not, whether to stay. Is this the place for me within those first like weeks? There's so much data that shows that. And if you don't get it right, you've already kind of lost with that person, and the level of engagement goes down. And so onboarding is so important. So those stages that we talked about in being like thinking about the moment they sign the offer letter, and often like what is the success of your onboarding process? Some people will define this as, I want the level of excitement that they had when they signed that offer letter to increase over time. And so in order to do that, we have to have touch points along the way. Often companies will be, okay, you sign the offer letter, we don't speak to you until that first day. And so what are all those moments in that employee's journey up to when they start on that first day? And then from the moment that they start, how are we introducing them to the organization? What does it look like to be successful for them in that role to fully ramp up? And what is a time frame to do that? And is that 30 or is it 60 or is it 90? And for some roles, it may just be 30 days. At other roles, if they're more senior, may take up to a year even. And so how do we then really break that down and design that experience? And in order to do that, we really need to understand for our organization, who are our employees? What are the roles? And how does that ramp time look? And so that ramp time should look different depending on the different employee personas that we have defined. And so for me, when I work with organizations, we define onboarding. It may look very different, especially as you go from industry to industry. It's easy to cut and paste what someone's done in one place to another, but each workplace ecosystem is different. The culture is different, and our onboarding needs to express the culture. So we do a disservice if we just think we can cut and paste something and that it's going to work well in the next organization that we go to.
I think that's the big challenge, because we want to take exactly what somebody did at a presentation or in a podcast interview or some template that someone's shared somewhere and say, this is what my onboarding process is going to look like. And I mean, it's not only is it different across industries, but company sizes, like locations, positions within the organization. Some require more formal training. It's hard to say. So I appreciate that you're telling us like it depends.
It depends.
But it should be a decision like on the process, like the steps of the process. It sounds like that is not just organized by HR, but has the buy-in of all the other stakeholders in who is involved in that individual person's hiring process.
Yes.
You might have a standard like process and steps, pre-boarding, onboarding, what does this look like, with like dates approximate, but know that it is different for every single person. I mean, I'm not even factoring in like if somebody has an accommodation request, or
that's right.
That's a whole other podcast episode. that we can talk like several podcast episodes, but
Yeah.
it's different for everybody, remote versus in person, hybrid, all the things. So it needs to be a committee conversation in terms
Yeah.
of the steps that are involved.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. And, when you asked about the CEO having a role, some of the best onboardings I've had are CEOs who are super passionate about finding a meaningful way to connect with everybody who is onboarding.
I ask, and I mention the CEO because a lot of times they like to, not all CEOs, but some CEOs like to be removed from it and like to scoff or say, like, this isn't my job, this is HR's job. But really, we are more of the project managers of the project of onboarding. We
Yes.
are not dealing with the day to day of everything that they do. There's a lot of other people. So when they just say, oh, that's HR's responsibility, I feel like it's a CEO that doesn't understand HR or people operations, or it's just somebody who might need some coaching or some candid conversations about how their business needs to be run with people in mind. And CEOs often don't get that feedback because everybody's scared, which is why fractional people that can come in and be like, hey, I'm going to give you the real right now,
Yes.
because they don't
Yes.
like it.
Right. And they
They're,
think everything's okay
they
because they're not
do, and
getting
it's
the
wrong.
feedback.
Yes, everybody was like, I'm worried about my job. I don't want to get fired. Like, I'm just going to make the CEO happy. So I'm going to sell them a different version of what's actually going on. But
Yeah.
what good CEOs want is the real version of what's going on with a plan or like a recommendation of next steps. I always like that. I don't like it when people come up and be like, here's what's wrong with everything, or this thing is broken. Come with me with, yes, it's broken, here's why it's broken, and then what's this, like a potential idea or solution to
Right.
fix it. That's a good consultant. That's also
Mm,
somebody in an organization that I want on my team,
yeah.
not somebody who's just bitching and moaning and complaining about all the things that are broken. Like, let's come up with a plan, or here's a couple ideas that I sourced on how we might correct this problem.
Yes. And I find that the CEOs who are part of onboarding are humanizing themselves and creating the invite and the permission for these new hires to do just what you said, to be able to come forward with ideas. Because now they see someone who's human. Yes, they have a title, but this person is approachable because they've given the permission.
Another benefit of being a fractional CE, people officer or fractional CHRO, is that you can fire your client when you find out that they're a jerk like that. So,
Yes.
and
Yes.
and then it's not like, yes, it's just 10 hours or so, but you still have two other clients and maybe somebody on reserve or another revenue stream. So that's also another conversation for another day. But I'm thinking, like, people stay for a long time in jobs that are miserable in
Yeah.
situations, but when you have other revenue coming in, once you uncover, because sometimes it happens, I've worked for clients that sound lovely, and then I get in there and then it is apparent that it's not the what I was sold in terms of what they need or how they operate. And I can just say, yeah, this isn't working out for me. This isn't working out for you. Let's just part ways. And that's fine.
Yes. Right. And as you get in there, they may have thought that they wanted to change, Jessica, but as they start to see what that actually looks like, they may opt in or out.
Yeah.
And that's where you're like, okay, that's okay. And that's also why good fractional leaders build a community of other um, fractional experts that, I think there's a lot of flavors of HR, right? There's people that are great at working in certain size organizations or, working with different types of CEOs. And so I have grown that community, and because I may not be the answer. So there may be a point where I'm working with someone. I said, hey, actually, we're kind of getting to where I need to transition out. This is the value alignment or my superpower. Now we need to transition to someone else. Here's 3 other people that I would highly recommend that are going to be able to meet you where you're at.
I love that. I love that. We all know that onboarding and offboarding can impact our employer brand, but breaking down all the moving parts of this very complex process in order to improve them can be daunting. And that's why it's so important to learn how other companies and tap into our experts are successfully doing things like this. Training on company policies, legal requirements, and dealing with these compliance issues is essential, but it's only a small part of what we do in terms of onboarding and also offboarding. I appreciate Mindy for sharing her expertise with us and experience on today's podcast episode. If you are looking for the full version of this podcast, it is exclusively available as part of our Workology Podcast Extended over on the Upskill HR community, where you can get access to trainings, learnings, podcasts, webinars, all available on demand for a monthly subscription. Head on over to Upskill HR to sign up and listen to the full 1-hour podcast worth 1 HRCI and 1 SHRM recertification credit. If you do have suggestions on future podcast topics, just go to my Instagram. It's at Workology Blog. Comment on my pinned posts and with the word podcast and make a suggestion, leave comments, and just any ideas for future guests. I do want to hear from you. Thank you for joining the Workology Podcast. It's sponsored by Upskill HR. Again, the hour-long podcast interview, the extended version, my whole conversation with Mindy on onboarding and offboarding is available exclusively for my Upskill HR members. We have over 100 hours of personal and professional development in the form of audio, videos, webcasts, and more. There's interviews like this one, all pre-approved for SHRM and HRCI recertification credits and PDCs. Visit upskillhr.com to sign up. This podcast is for the disruptive workplace leader who's tired of the status quo. Thank you for joining me today. My name's Jessica Miller-Merrell, and until next time, visit workology.com to listen to all our podcast episodes of the Workology Podcast. Have a great day.